Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining me for my talk today about micro cannabis licenses and cannabis nursery licenses and some of the myths and realities of the licensing process, as well as a little bit of a background and a lead in to sort of regulatory interpretation. But really, what I was hoping to start off with today is to talk a little bit about some of the work that I'm doing with StratCan to really try to highlight some of the very new, unique, and interesting players entering the cannabis space, especially in some of these newer license categories. I want to take just a couple minutes to sort of walk through some of these license categories, which I think will really inform the second half of my talk in a few minutes when I'm talking about some of these license categories. This will provide an opportunity to see some examples of what some of these licenses look like, the sort of diversity of license holders we're seeing in Canada. When I started publishing StratCan in the middle of March, right as we were just starting this journey of COVID-19, was Euphorium in southern Ontario, not too far from Ottawa. And they are a standalone micro cultivation license outdoor. They estimate that their initial startup cost to get them to the stage of licensing was only around $75,000. The licensing process took them about 1 year, and their facility is just on their existing farm, which is part of why they've been able to keep this cost so low. And this is, I think, one of the examples of the types of farms that we're seeing emerge within these new micro license categories, especially the standalone micro cultivation categories. And so I'd like to just sort of walk through a few of these examples and talk about timelines and cost, because you can in Alberta as another micro cultivation license. They are indoor, actually growing in grow pods. And so they're an example. We looked at that other one, Euphorium, that was just under $100,000 to get to that stage of licensing. Whereas Because You Can, largely because they did an indoor site, was a fair bit over the $1 million mark. And they teamed up with an existing licensed producer as well to help them sort of do a plug and play, if you will. But this I think provides a good juxtaposition of some of the other types of farms that we're seeing, and so utilizing these grow pods on their existing farm space. So North 40 Cannabis, another of the very early micros that I had the privilege to interview very early on, who many consumers I think are now becoming aware of and becoming fans of their product already. And so Gord and his wife at North 40 and their family, it took them around 8 months from that initial evidence package to licensing. Gord admits that he built not only a Cadillac, but I believe he said a Bentley, and spent just a little over $2 million for his indoor purpose-built facility. Gord seems to know what he's doing and is willing to pay a little bit more to get exactly what he wants, hoping to, or I believe he actually has his processing license now as well and is working on his sales license and is currently working with a third-party processor. And I think a good example of someone even with this relatively high cost to entry seems to be doing quite well in the market. Consumers are quite happy with their product. Another example on the other side of the extreme is Katie and her husband Sean at Sea Dog Farms on Vancouver Island. Again, just around 8 months from that first evidence package to their initial license. She estimates that it cost them around $15,000 for their license, largely because they had an existing 5-acre farm. They had some existing infrastructure like a fence. They had a building they were able to relatively affordably retrofit for an indoor drying, curing, storage space. But nonetheless, a standalone micro cultivation license that they were able to bring in for around $15,000. And in fact, you can look online. Katie has a wonderful presentation that she's put up on YouTube that talks about her entire process. This is just sort of one screenshot from that that talks about kind of the cost breakdown of her licensing for her Health Canada application fee, two security screening fees, the annual Health Canada fee, and the CRA deposit. And here's an example of the retrofitted indoor space that was just sort of a storage garage space that is now serving as all indoor activities, I believe, other than administrative duties. And so you can kind of get a good sense of how kind of small scale you can do this. It obviously helps if you're already starting with land and starting with a farm. But some good different examples of the types of farms. So ANC Cannabis is another standalone micro cultivator working indoor. They're actually operating largely at this point as a nursery, although they are operating under a micro cultivation license, and they seem to really be emerging in the market as a seed producer in several provinces, which is really great to see. We look at their timeline. This one a bit longer than some of the others, a little over a year. Because they did a lot of the work themselves on their indoor facility, they estimated they were able to do it in just under $1 million. Still not the cheapest, but if you're looking at entering any kind of legal regulated space, if you're opening, frankly, a coffee shop, much less say a brewery, you're looking to be spending potentially a lot more than that as well. So ANC is another example of someone I think coming in at a pretty affordable rate. Hearst Organic is another one of the first micros I started having conversations with earlier this year. If not the first micro license holder, I believe the first sort of started after October 17th, 2018 micro license holder. You can see his greenhouse here, and he is standalone, I believe currently still a standalone micro cultivator. Estimates that he got in there at around $750,000 in around 10 months to get to that space of licensing. And it's not all sunshine and roses, but you can get a sense of the different opportunities to enter the market. And you can check out some of these stories on the website that talk about the different prices, give some examples of the different nurseries, different micro cultivators, different micro processors, the type of timelines they had. Hidden Harvest here, their nursery license that he estimates took him around 5 months turnaround, and he spent around $65,000, not including the land and existing infrastructure, but nonetheless getting that nursery license, at a starting point of well under $100,000, which is achievable for a lot more people than a standard license. Weathered Islands Craft Cannabis on Texada Island, I think, is a great example of sort of a legacy producer, not only bringing those legacy genetics in, but bringing their experience in. They were able to get their cannabis nursery license, they estimated, for around $35,000 in around 6 months' time, and they're doing sort of an indoor and a hoop house. Here's a nice picture of their very small space. You can see, very modest perimeter security, indoor space, and hoop house there. And as a nursery, they could potentially have the ability to expand, but a very affordable starting rate to kind of get the foot in the door and start as a cannabis nursery. Mother Labs, I think, is a great example of the other side of the spectrum from someone like Weathered Island. Mother Labs estimates they spent well over $2 million on their nursery license, which they got in around 10 months. They have some very advanced infrastructure and are really looking to serve the broader B2B licensing arrangement and supplying cannabis genetics to cultivators. And so obviously they invested quite a bit more than someone who is maybe operating at a smaller scale. And you can see that you could spend quite a lot, or you don't have to spend quite a lot, and you can still find an opportunity in that space as well. Cypress Craft is another great example in North Cyprus in Manitoba. Around 6 month time, they estimate they spent a little over $1 million, 1.3 million. They're growing in some indoor grow pods, and so you can get a sense of the sort of retrofit that you can do with something like that, like a sea can or like a tractor trailer, perhaps. You can see that they've actually stacked up some sea cans inside an existing facility there, so you can get a sense of where that 1.3 million went in building and retrofitting all of that infrastructure. So another great example of very small scale and someone who's taking, I think, a very unique approach for a processor. And while not a micro, is doing a very small scale approach to processing is Colson Cannabis, which they estimate around 6-month turnaround. They weren't really comfortable with talking about the cost, but you can get us, and they're looking to focus on very small scale craft extracts, non-solvent extracts, and so you can see kind of the inside of their facility, very modest, a relatively easy entry point to the market for someone who's looking to do solventless extraction and really cater to a very high quality craft extract brand. So not to skip over too many. West River Cannabis, I think, is another early entry into the nursery space. They actually got their license, they estimated, in only around 3 months turnaround, and they spent around $130,000, which includes a new building and all of the licensing. And they are indoor and outdoor in a brand new purpose-built facility and existing on or joining a family nursery there. So utilizing a lot of existing infrastructure and professional expertise, but still a very affordable entry point into the nursery space and an incredibly fast timeline, only 3 months. Some of the other ancillary services. So willow weed, I think, is another example that shows the ability to come in, especially if you own land, at a very low cost. So they are another outdoor cultivator who got their license for around $15,000. They estimated around 8 months' time. If you speak with Jacob, he's incredibly hopeful. He has his criticisms and his frustrations with the process, but he and his dad largely did everything themselves on their land. You can see that they utilized an existing tractor trailer. They've got a great image here that shows sort of a before and after of how they retrofitted that trailer. So you can see how you can start with something like this and end with something like this, and eventually get yourself approved. And something I'll talk about a little bit later, but I think this is a great example. You do need your infrastructure in place when you apply, but this is a good example where you can apply, really at this stage if you're providing a lot of evidence of what your plans are. You don't necessarily need to sink a lot of money into the after stage before the application. And it may mean that your application takes a little bit longer if you haven't dialed everything in before, but it can also potentially mean that you aren't spending money on something that was unnecessary, or you were overthinking, or you weren't quite contemplating exactly what the regulations were asking for. And so there's another example there of someone coming in at a very affordable $15,000 to get themselves to a place of having a license. And so the last one I'm going to talk about here today, Done Cannabis, is another very recent one here in British Columbia, transitioned from the MMAR and ACMPR space. So he's a good example of someone who has transitioned from that legacy space and seems very hopeful about the opportunities for someone like himself to operate in that market. And I know I mentioned only doing one more, but I want to give one more example here of one of my most recent interviews with Denise at Unique Organica in Quebec, because I think that she's a very unique license and that she is a standalone microprocessor. We don't see too many of those. It took her around 10 to 12 months, and she estimates, bare bones initial startup was around 50,000, not including some infrastructure costs that she will be incurring now that she's licensed. So she started without adding all of that extra equipment in, got her license, and now she'll be spending probably around that again to fill out the facility. But an example of someone who's looking to utilize that small scale processing for small craft sort of health and beauty products. And I think that there's a lot of opportunity when you can see yourself getting into that space at such a relatively low price. And so from there, I want to jump over to the rest of my presentation, but I thought that this was a good opportunity to look at some of these examples of the different license holders, the many different types of license holders that are out there, and the different approaches that people can take from highly sophisticated to very do-it-yourself and small family-oriented operations. Okay, so we'll jump back over to this now. So, as with many things related to cannabis, there is always a good deal of misinformation and confusion that can lead people operating in or looking to operate in this industry to make poor decisions. And so, I'd like to try to address some of the common misconceptions, as well as talk about some of the foundation and background of the broader cannabis regulations and the license categories that exist within it. This understanding of the foundation and the context of the Cannabis Act and cannabis regulations can help in better understanding and interpreting the cannabis regulations and therefore understanding how to navigate the licensing process. The categories like microcultivation and processing and the nursery license category can represent an excellent opportunity for small businesses to enter the cannabis space, and to do so will require separating fact from fiction and coming to understand how to read and follow the regulations that will both guide your application as well as hopefully your licensed business. So just first, a little bit about myself. As I said, my name is David Brown. I am a advisor with a company called StratCan Services Inc., as well as a content manager. I also just spent the last 2 years with Health Canada's Cannabis and Legalization and Regulation branch as a policy advisor on those regulations, as well as working with the external relations team on outreach with different communities, especially here in British Columbia, with First Nations, RCMP, and other community groups. And one of the things that I did when I would give those talks and had this opportunity to speak to the community about the cannabis regulations was I was always sort of start off by talking about one of the ways that I think it's important to look at legalization. And that's often in juxtaposition to a lot of the models that we see, say, in the United States that really focus on issues like revenue generation or even freedom or liberty, and not so much issues of public health, limiting access to young people, and strict regulatory control like we see here in Canada. My point of starting off with this foundation was always to help people better understand why the government is legalizing, and also how to better formulate critiques of legalization. Because without understanding the goals and priorities of legalization, you can't effectively navigate it or critique it. So in discussing these specific license categories, like micro and nursery, it's going to be important to understand how to read these aspects of the regulations, how to understand them, and how to read between the lines. And that is how we know the context and the intent of the cannabis regulations and within these different license categories. So the context of these existing license categories requires a little bit of history first before we get into those myths and realities. So if you go all the way back to the first commercial medical regime in Canada, the MMPR, and then evolving into the ACMPR, one of the many complaints leveled against the regime at the time was the cost of compliance. So the cost of building a facility that could adhere to the strict high bar of those regulations was often said to be too expensive, too overbroad for any of the many small mom and pop farms that grew commercially in Canada, either supplying the local communities, dispensaries, or as an alternative to the legal corporate medical regime. And these concerns were obviously not unfounded. The cost of adhering to the regulations, circa say 2015 or 2016, under the MMPR, requirements like massive vaults, advanced security systems, cameras, infrared sensors, massive fences, thick walls, and significant regulatory oversight would often mean that building a facility could cost several $1,000,000 just in infrastructure. This is, of course, not the case in every instance, and you can definitely look back at those early days within the MMPR and see some very small businesses who did, a very sort of bootstrap startup. But in general, I think there's a deserved perception that the regulations were really built, only for highly moneyed, deep pockets and resource-intensive corporations. And because of those realities, what the government did was propose some of these new models to sort of address some of those issues. And some of those things were the micro and nursery category. So when putting together the regulations that would eventually become the cannabis regulations, which came into force in 2018, one of the issues considered was this knowledge that there need to be a way to address the regulatory burden and allow a way for these small farmers, again, people who were telling us they were small mom and pop operations, to find a way to get licensed and to be able to take part in legalization. That is, in a way for them to transition what they were doing in the illicit market into the light, so to speak, and a way for them to just grow cannabis, as many of them said they wanted to do, not to become large-scale processors or even large-scale growers, just grow good cannabis and just process small batches of edibles like chocolates or candies, all at a very craft scale. And envisioning this, there was a recognition from the government and policymakers that coming up with this new regime, overall the regulations were not going to become drastically lessened. The security concerns alone, especially for much larger facilities, often growing and in possession of finished products worth millions of dollars, were not likely to be dramatically changed. To address this, there were a handful of proposals, though, including the idea of dividing up what was, at the time, just one license to produce, an LP, and separating that into categories that could be done either separately or combined. By doing so, this provided a way to allow someone who just wanted to grow cannabis to not have to invest in any aspects of processing just to be able to adhere to the licensing requirements. Similarly, those who just wanted to process raw cannabis didn't need to waste their time with the cultivation side of licensing at all. In doing so, this is a way to somewhat streamline the licensing and the associated costs of complying with those requirements. But this only addressed a one-size-fits-all approach to both of these categories, that is, cultivation and processing. So to further create even more opportunity and to further create an opportunity to scale back some of the associated costs of things like security requirements, other categories were conceived of, such as micro-cultivation and micro-processing, as well as the cannabis nursery licenses. The idea behind these subcategories was that a license holder who was the kind of mom and pop the branch had been hearing about for years, who was growing a more limited amount of cannabis at a small craft scale, that there could be a justification for allowing even lower security requirements because they would have less product on site. So that is to say, if you only have a relatively small amount of plants and dried flower on hand, then the risk of theft is theoretically lower than someone with several times that amount, and therefore security requirements don't need to be seen as being quite as robust. So the requirement for things like visual monitoring of micro cultivation facilities, for example, was removed, leaving only a requirement for a simple perimeter security of a basic fence or wall in most instances. Another known cost for license holders is the requirement for a trained quality assurance professional. And finding a quality assurance professional can be very costly, can be upwards of $100,000 depending on what part of the country you live in. And by removing that requirement for a quality assurance professional for those standalone micro cultivators, that was another way to sort of cut off logistic and resource requirements that could otherwise be a barrier to entry. So with these two fairly big pieces cleaved off, what was traditional and what was this traditional LP license, the idea was that a micro license holder could get to the point of having a license, not to mention managing day-to-day operations, while investing far less than someone applying for, say, a 100,000 square foot facility. In addition to that, the actual cost of licensing was brought down, since the idea was that it's easier to process an application for a smaller facility and easier to inspect one once licensed. So the cost of applying for a micro is around $6,000 to maybe $12,000 compared to $30,000 or much more for a standard license application, depending on how many security clearance applications are attached to that license. And so here in this next slide, you can see some examples of those application screening fees, CRA fees, security clearances, and things like that. And you can see some of the price differences there between a micro and a nursery and a standard license holder. And on this next slide, you can see some information about the license for the nursery and some of those authorized activities. And so in addition to the micro-cultivation and the micro-processing licenses, what Health Canada conceived of was a nursery category. And part of the idea behind creating the nursery category, one of the goals, was to create a supply for new genetics for commercial growers, because there was a known bottleneck up to that point, prior to legalization, with really only a limited amount of legal genetics within the legal system. So if you look at the next slide, you'll see some information about licensing for nurseries. And in addition to those microcultivation and microprocessing licenses, the next license category that Health Canada was conceiving of was cannabis nurseries. And one of the issues they were seeking to address with a cannabis nursery license was the issue of getting new genetics into the legal system and being able to provide a source of starting material for cultivators, especially micro cultivators, who, because they have a limited amount of approved canopy space, may benefit from being able to order, mothers, clones, teens that they can just put straight, pretty quickly put into flower in those grow rooms and maximize that space. But another important piece of the cannabis nursery license that I think is often overlooked, that was very much considered by Health Canada in its creation, was that these nursery licenses could also be sort of one-stop garden centers for cannabis consumers, to ensure that there is a way for people who are authorized to grow, up to 4 plants in their own home, depending on the province that they're in, that they have a legal source of starting material for those operations. And one of the interesting things that I think is often overlooked, and we'll talk about Farmgate a little bit later, but I think one of the things that was envisioned with these nursery licenses was this idea of a one-stop garden shop that could likely function under a sort of direct sale farm gate model, where a cannabis nursery could sell seeds, clones, shovels, soil, nutrients, garden books, could be sort of a one-stop shop garden center. And so I think that's another piece of the nursery license that is often really overlooked. So if you look at the next slide here, you can see some examples of some of the cannabis nurseries that are in Canada right now. And another goal with this license category was to create a cultivation licensing category for those who didn't want to grow for flower, but just wanted to be able to grow for starting material or even be able to do cannabis breeding. And so rather than paying for a license that assumed this commercial scale flower production and the necessary security systems, a facility that only grows clones, for example, has a much lower security risk and therefore much lower security requirements, potentially even than micro cultivation licenses, in addition to obviously a standard cultivation license. Now, obviously, these are all big picture ideas, and each site and plan will have very different requirements. It's important to remember that a 100,000 square foot nursery, and there is no size limit on nurseries in terms of non-flowering material, so it would be, in theory, possible to have a nursery of that size. And if you did have something of that scale, you would likely require, a bit more robust security systems, for example, than say, a much smaller, 1,000 square foot or 20,000 square foot nursery. Okay, so that's some of the background of the intent and the goals of the regulations, which is obviously to create license categories to address these concerns, that adhering to the regulations is too costly, and that the licenses are too one-size-fits-all for the diversity of these kinds of mom-and-pop farms scattered across Canada, while still addressing the government's main concerns built within the Act of a strong, regulated supply chain that can withstand outside scrutiny over time. So I have one more small piece of context to discuss about the regulations themselves, and then we can get into those myths and realities. So when reading and seeking to adhere to these regulations, it's important to also understand how to read them, how to understand the intention of those who wrote them, and what it was they were seeking to convey. So a key piece of this, as it relates to the cannabis regulations here in Canada, and in fact many regulatory regimes in Canada, is the concept of outcome-based regulations as opposed to prescriptive regulations. So outcome-based regulations, as you can see on the slide here, they refer to regulations that describe the desired result that regulated parties need to meet rather than the specific means by which they must be achieved. So on the slide, you can see these examples of government that the government gives, juxtaposing outcome-based and prescriptive-based regulations. So on one hand, you have prescriptive regulations that give regulated parties a very specific set of guidelines, and this can give a very clear idea of what is and isn't allowed, which can be very helpful, but it also means the regulated party has a very narrow area of compliance, very narrow line. Conversely, if you look at outcome-based regulations, it allows the regulator to give a much more broad outline of intent to give the desired outcome while giving the regulated party more room to interpret them as they see fit and would be relevant for their business. And this is important when understanding the cannabis regulations because what is relevant to meet the intent of the regulations for a very small organization, for a very small operation, is arguably going to be very different than a much larger operation. And so when reading the cannabis regulations, it's important to keep all of this in mind. And the regulations that are not always telling you exactly what you need to do, often they may tell you what you can't do. but they're giving you more of a desired outcome that is up to you to justify and adhere to within your own standard operating procedures. So really it's about building out your own standard operating procedures that explain to the regulator how you are fulfilling their requirements within what makes sense for you. So with all that said, I hope that gives a little bit of understanding of why these categories exist, what the government's goals and priorities are in creating and maintaining them. And I think it's important to see that these categories aren't limitations, but it's a better way to look at them as a starting point for those who are not able to access significant resources to start at a very large scale. And once you get even a small scale operation in place, you can really build that business slow and sustainably over time, really at a pace that suits you, well, without being limited by these sizes. And that brings me to this next point here that is really important to remember, and is that micros do not necessarily lock you into 200 square meters. So you don't need to look at the concept of a micro cultivation license as you're only able to grow 200 square meters. If you want to grow more, you have the ability to start at a micro and then potentially expand over time, or you have the ability to start with a standard license at still a much smaller scale that will still have much lower upfront costs and associated regulatory barriers than you're going to have if you're, say, building a 100,000 square foot greenhouse somewhere. So I think it's really important to understand that micro categories, nursery categories, can be a really excellent starting point for someone who's looking to get into it. Maybe they want to sort of figure out several things before they really dive in, 100%. And it's something that you can do at a pretty small scale. And so now that we've talked about all of that, we're going to get into some of these truths, myths, and realities. So myth number one that we're going to start with, and frankly, we're almost 2 years into legalization, and I'm surprised that this is a myth that still is very common, but I will still need to address it. And this is the idea that micros have to sell to licensed producers. And I think this is a good place to start because I think it really emphasizes the difference between seeing regulations as limitations versus seeing opportunities. So standalone cultivators are indeed required to sell to a processor to get their product to market. But this doesn't mean micros are somehow beholden to this idea of big licensed producers. There are currently over 200 processing licenses issued in Canada, and while not all of them are seeking to process for others, there are numerous processors who are of all shapes and sizes who are looking to establish themselves as catering to these standalone cultivators, both micro and standard, and really all shapes and sizes. And so it's important, from my perspective, that people recognize that they aren't locked into that relationship. And while a new micro is entering the market, being able to establish those relationships with these processors who've taken the time to develop the processing side as well as develop a supply chain relationship with different provinces and different retailers can really bring a lot of value to the table for someone who's maybe in their first or second season of growing and really doesn't have the capacity to take on all these other issues. And again, you're not necessarily locked into those relationships. That can really be seen as one step to getting yourself to a place where perhaps you have your own processing license as well. And so as I mentioned earlier, the reason for creating these separate cultivator and processing license categories was to allow those who only want to do one thing to be able to do one thing. But that doesn't mean that those who want to do both can't do both. And so if you want a micro cultivation and a micro processing license so that you can have the opportunity to sell into these provincial markets directly, you still have that option. If you don't want to take on all of that added cost, all of that added regulatory challenge, and all you want to do is grow, or at least all you want to do is grow for the first few years, then you have that opportunity without having to go through all those extra steps. So a micro who only wants to grow cannabis, doesn't care how to deal with that B2C or that business to consumer relationship, has that ability to really start even at a much smaller scale. So the second myth is the idea that you need millions of dollars to start a micro. And obviously, millions of dollars in whatever you're doing is always going to help. But I think it's important to see that there are a lot of opportunities within these regulations for people to start at a much smaller scale. And I'm currently aware of at least 3 outdoor standalone cultivation licenses in Canada who've done it for around $15,000 to $20,000. That's all told, and it's important to understand that's only getting them to the starting point. They still have to prove out their successful business. And all of these businesses talk about the challenges of getting licensed. That's not to say it's easy, But there are examples of people obviously getting these licenses for well under several $1,000,000. And if you tried to tell someone that that was possible, even just a year or two ago, people would sort of laugh at you. And so I think it's important for people to emphasize that there are a lot of people doing it, not only at these very low sort of outlier rates that I'm showing you, $15,000, $20,000 with someone who already owns their own land. There are people doing it for under 100,000, around $100,000 or $200,000. And while there are indoor micros who are spending up to $2 million or more for a very nice, very dialed in facility, there are a lot of people doing it for a lot less. And so I think it's important to communicate that to prospective applicants, prospective license holders, is that you don't need to have very deep pockets. There can be a lot of challenges. There can be regulatory challenges. There can be jurisdictional challenges, especially at the municipal level in a lot of areas. But you don't need millions of dollars necessarily. Okay, so our next myth is that you have to hire consultants. And I think at this point, I think there's been enough license holders who've done it, if not completely on their own, almost entirely on their own, that this isn't too much of a myth anymore. But it's an important one to repeat. And while there are many very valuable, very knowledgeable consultants out there who can bring a lot of value for an applicant, I think it's really important to remember that if you don't know how to navigate the regulations yourself, at some point you're going to have to face these very same issues. You're not going to have a consultant with you all the time. And so from my perspective, a valuable way to approach those regulations and reaching out to consultants or advisors is looking to take on as much of this as you can on your own first, figuring out the gaps where you need help, and then going and talking to people. And that can be the difference between spending a few thousand, maybe 10,000 on a consultant versus spending $50,000 or $100,000 to sort of hand something off, have someone fill everything out for you, and really just deliver a license and then kind of walk away. And if you have that money to spend that's great. But I think that there's a lot lost there, because ultimately you're going to face a regulator coming in and inspecting your facility. And if you don't know why you did something because someone filled everything out for you, you're going to have a harder time at that level. And so I think it's important to understand that the regulations are sort of being able to fill out the regulations and understand them is really the very first step of being regulated. And it's sort of a boot camp for the process of once you get licensed and when that marathon really starts. So you don't need a consultant. You really should look at doing everything that you can do on your own, and then figure out those areas where you're weak and where where your knowledge is lacking, and where you can ask targeted questions rather than handing something off to someone entirely. Okay, so the next slide here is a reality, which is start small and build out. And obviously, hopefully this would be a very obvious issue. But I think a lot of people have come to look at most of the prominent examples where we see very big production facilities, and there's this tendency to believe that you need to go really over the top from the very beginning. When you're looking at things, especially at the micro cultivation or the nursery or the micro processing stage, there are a lot of examples out there, and I'll have a few slides up here now that talk about, that show some examples of some of these very, less than overly sophisticated operations where people are making it work using sea cans or a tractor trailer or an old refurbished barn or garage space. You really don't need to overthink these too much. And it's another piece there to understand and to remember is that while you do have to have your facility built out before you apply for a license, you don't need to have it completely sort of tricked out. You don't need all of the equipment in there. You just need your facility. You need most of your adhering to those SOPs that are in place. But really, you can start that process as soon as you have your license or your facility in place. And you can look at that first evidence package that you submit really as the beginning of a conversation with Health Canada, where you can in some ways use Health Canada as a consultant, where if you have questions, you can tell them what your intent is and why you've done something a certain way. They're almost certainly going to come back with a lot of questions. They may come back with a request for more information or an intent to refuse. And that really just gives you an opportunity to then address their concerns, respond to them, and make those kinds of changes. And so rather than spending too much to really put the final touches on that facility, I think it's important to remember to really start slow, take each little step, sort of make sure you don't overbuild, and make sure that you are looking at some of the most efficient ways to adhere to the spirit and intent of those regulations in ways that make sense for your licensed facility. Okay, so the next slide is another reality, and it's a reminder to remember that regulations are not detailed advice. So it's don't look at the regulations as giving you detailed advice on how to do something. As I had mentioned earlier, with the idea of outcome-based versus prescriptive regulations, they're giving you the general idea of what the end goal should be, and so it's up to you to make the case for how your chosen approach will be carefully detailed in your SOPs and followed to a T and will satisfy those demands. And if you can make a compelling case to the regulator that the way you're doing it will meet their demands, and there really are a lot of examples of very creative ways that people are doing this. And so it's important to know that it's not going to tell you exactly what to do, but I think it's important to remember that that's an opportunity ultimately, and not a limitation. And this goes back to this comment that I talked about the, at the very beginning, understanding how to read the regulations, understanding the intent of the regulations. And while they can be very complicated, I think if you're able to do, your own taxes, really you can take these one step at a time as well. And so one example that I like to use here is within the regulations for a standalone microcultivator, they're going to ask for perimeter security. And so how will you interpret what perimeter security means for your site? Are you going to interpret that as giant walls with infrared cameras and dogs and a moat with sharks? Or are you going to say, I'm going to put up a chain link fence. I've got some natural obstacles that are providing added barriers. Maybe I live in a rural area where I'm not as concerned about diversion as maybe a condensed urban area. And so look at what makes sense for your site. Don't sort of go over the top right away. Figure out the way that you can do it in a way that fits your budget and fits your site and fits your own goals and intentions. So the next slide is the one-time genetics transfer. And this is a really important piece of any new license category that I think most people are making good advantage of. And that's that ability to bring in starting material in a one-time only scenario of really any quantity, as long as you're very carefully documenting that, being able to bring in seeds, clones, mother plants, tissue culture, bringing in unique genetics that can help distinguish yourself, and building up that library for yourself that over time, over the coming years, you can start to tap into. And so making good advantage of that, but also very carefully documenting everything you're bringing in, because CRA will come in and they will count every seed. They will count every single plant. And so you need to have that documented because they want their taxes on every single little seed. Okay, the next one is supply chain realities, and growing and selling weed in the black market, if that's what you have been doing, is relatively easy compared to working in a licensed, highly regulated space. Growing a crop, harvesting a crop, selling it off to a broker or a friend can be quite easy. Being able to be prepared for the logistical challenges of working within this highly regulated environment, I think this is going to be something that trips up a lot of people, is not contemplating some of the issues of coming into the provincial markets, some of the requirements we're hearing from provinces in terms of insurance requirements, 60, 90, 120-day turnaround on payment, not being interested in small batches. I think we're seeing the provinces slowly begin to understand they have to work with smaller producers, but right now these are hurdles that people need to be prepared to navigate. And from what I see, this is one of the advantages of working with some of the existing producers who have already established those supply chains. Is get your feet under you, know how to grow well, hand it off to someone who knows how to sell well until your brand is established, and then if you're ready to take on that next step, you can. But like I say, be aware of those challenges at the provincial level. It's not necessarily going to be just as easy, as selling off your weed. And you need to obviously figure out what a per gram price is going to be to make your business sustainable, and take some very hard, conservative, overly realistic looks at what some producers are getting right now. Large scale, kind of low quality, we're seeing well under $1 a gram. I think with some of the much higher quality product that is demanding 15, 12, 15 plus a gram, we're seeing these guys getting 3 to 5 a gram, maybe more wholesale. If you think you're capable of that, build that in. But everyone has this trouble with those first couple crops, and potentially bake that into your to your business plan too. That your first couple crops may not be amazing. And the other piece there, in terms of your crop being amazing, is having plans for mitigation. being aware of some of the challenges of getting your products tested, reaching out to laboratories early and having these kinds of conversations so that you understand what you're getting into, because this is a whole other piece that I think can ultimately be a barrier, especially if you're not prepared for it. And we're hearing this from some producers who, some newer, licensed micros who are running into some challenges at the lab level. And so, being prepared for that, covering all your bases early on, looking at the supply chain challenges, so that you can also just grow your weed. And so that, in closing, is some of what I think are some good perspectives to take into account if you're looking to get into the space, some of the realities of the space, some of the intention behind the regulations, and some examples that we're now seeing from the market of some of these individuals who are coming in, some of the lessons learned, some of the frustrations, some of the opportunities, and reaching out and learning more from these people if you're looking to get into that, and taking the time to understand how to navigate the regulations. Be prepared to take this one step at a time. Do as much as you can yourself, and recognize that there's a lot of opportunity here. There's a lot of hurdles, but there's a lot of opportunity. And I'd like to thank HempFest for having me speak. I'd like to thank everyone for taking the time to listen to me, and I will be available to answer any questions. All right. Have a great afternoon.